पृथिवी शान्तिरन्तरिक्षगं शान्तिर्द्यौः शान्तिर्दिशः शान्तिरवान्तरदिशा शान्तिरग्निः शान्तिर्वायुः शान्तिरादित्यः शान्तिश्चन्द्रमा शान्तिर्नक्षत्राणि शान्तिरापः शान्तिरोषधयः शान्तिर्वनस्पतयः शान्तिर्गौः शान्तिरजा शान्तिरश्वः शान्तिः पुरुषः शान्तिर्ब्रह्म शान्तिर्ब्राह्मणः शान्तिः शान्तिरेव शान्तिः शान्तिर्मे Astu Shantihi. May there be peace on earth and in the sky. May there be peace in the water and in all directions. May there be peace in the plants, in the trees, and in animals. May there be peace in the hearts of all beings. May there be peace in everyone and in everything. Sarvetra sukhinas santu, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschit dukkha bhag bhavet, sarvastaratu durgani, sarvo bhadrani pashyatu, sarvas sadbuddhimapnotu, Sarvas Sarvatra Nandatu. May all be happy and healthy. May all see what is good, and may no one experience misery. May all overcome their obstacles and acquire good tendencies. May people everywhere find joy and fulfillment. Let us now spend some time touching the center of peace and joy in our hearts. A good way to begin the practice is to withdraw the scattered energies of the mind and bring them to rest on one point. That point can be our own breathing. Let us therefore practice breathing with awareness. As we breathe in, let us visualize that our body and mind are being filled with love, strength, and compassion. And as we breathe out, let us release all the stress, anxiety, and exhaustion in the body and mind. Let us practice this way for a while. Let us now turn our attention to the region of our heart. Although God is present everywhere and in everyone, the divine presence can be felt most clearly in our own hearts. We can meditate in any way we have been taught. To remain focused, we can take the help of a short mental prayer or a mantra or a divine name. Let us now spend some time dwelling on the presence of God in our hearts. Om Asato Ma Satkamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravirmagedhi Rudrayatte Dakshinam Mukham Tenamam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. Today we begin the study of Swamiji's paper on Hinduism. So this is the most substantive presentation that Swami Vivekananda made, at least among the records that have become available to us now. Unlike the other talks which were given extempore, this one was a paper that Swamiji read. And as we saw the history, until the last moment, he was not even sure whether he would be accepted as a parliament. So while all the other speakers who had confirmed their registration and their delegate status, they had prepared speeches, but Swamiji had a limited time. I would imagine, since it began on the 11th of September, he probably had maybe a little over a week or 10 days to get this. Now, in that limited time that he had, we find that is in this short essay, Swamiji packs so much information, and it's not just information. He had to present the essential ideals of the Hindu tradition. There were other speakers from India at the parliament who were representing specific organizations or specific traditions within the larger tradition. There was a representative from the Brahmo Samaj, there was a representative from the Theosophical Society, So there were many representing smaller denominations and organizations. And Swamiji was there as a representative of Hinduism per se. Now, as will become clear when we see this, now Hinduism being historically one of the oldest traditions, it's like a vast ocean. Now, to try to find the common basis of Hinduism, it's a task only those people recognize the vastness of that task, only those who have even tried it. Even people who are born within the tradition may identify themselves as Hindus, but that by no means assumes that they know everything about Hinduism. In fact, very few people know very little. In some sense, that is true about most of these ancient world religions. We might identify ourselves as Hindus, Muslims, Christians, and so on. But the traditions are now, especially some of these major traditions, have been around for centuries. And the scope of their philosophy, their ritual, their mythology has expanded so much that nobody can really claim to have understood or grasped the entirety of the tradition that they feel they belong to. And in Hinduism, the problem becomes even more complex because just I think we'll go to the problems more as we start reading it. But briefly, just to make a brief introduction, the present generation of students who are studying Hinduism, both those who are born within the Hindu tradition and those who are studying Hinduism from outside, those who are not within the tradition, we are using the language and we are using the methodologies that were not indigenous to the tradition itself, mostly. In other words, how do we get to know any tradition? And it's a big subject. It's like when you get let's say you get a new iPhone. What does it mean to know the iPhone? Well, one thing would be, well, I guess for most of us, we know what an iPhone can do. Most of us have no idea how it does in that small little thing, what kind of technology is working within it. So we can probably appreciate the external beauty and say a lot about its appearance. But then those who know a little bit about coding and programming, and they might know about industrial designing, and they might open it up and try to find some more information about it. So this question about what does it mean to know an iPhone, it's not very different from like what does it mean to know about a religion? Because we can just know from the external. So what do the Christians do? What do the Muslims do? What do the Hindus do? It's like looking at it from outside. But what is going on in their heads while they do those things? And that's the kind of entering into then takes us inside. So the method of study, because of the dominance of Western ways of doing things, Western methods of learning, and because of the economic, military, and political power of the Western world, pretty much the influence it has over the rest of the world, it does distort the picture a little bit. Now, for instance, people within India, now which is presently around 85% are Hindus, even for India being under colonial rule for 350 years, and before that for 600 years under the Muslim rule, all of the system of education and learning was really not determined by the people themselves, other than those who were ruling over them. And so, even when these texts are studied, we apply Western methods to study Eastern texts. Now, it's not that it is useless, but that what it does, gives us one way of studying it. How would we know if an Eastern method of studying Eastern text, it might show us something different than a Western method? So these are little complicated issues. And I had a chance, I was lucky enough in the 80s to study Vedanta under a Vedic scholar who had never gone to school. So he didn't have any degree. From a childhood, he went to a Vedic school. And so he was a master of Vedas. He knew Vedanta perfectly. He could speak fluently in Sanskrit. And so it was a little bit, I was able to get a little bit of glimpse of what does it mean to study the Hindu texts with minimal contact with Western methods of seeing. And I, of course, I studied in an education system which was still pretty much a carryover of the system developed by the British time. And I studied mostly in English. I knew Sanskrit, but my way of thinking was very much the modern system of education. And so it was a rare opportunity. That breed of teachers is fast vanishing, even within India. You still have great Vedanta scholars, but they have all kind of risen through the university system. Anyway, so that's a fairly long introduction. And I mention all this to show that the presentation that Swami Vivekananda made here about Hinduism is an attempt to understand the tradition from within. Now, Swami Vivekananda himself was a product of Western education. Although he studied in India, but it was still during the British India. Many of his teachers were, in fact, of British origin. He was very much influenced by Western philosophy in his teenage years. So he himself was the product of Western upbringing. But because of the teaching and the learning that he was able to do under the guidance of Sri Ramakrishna, we know that in a way he had the best of both the worlds. And so therefore his take on what Hinduism is of special relevance to us today. So let's read this. It begins, it's possible to, as I said, the first section of there are no subheadings to this essay, but we can create our own subheadings. And I have isolated about 9 bases of Hinduism that Swamiji refers to throughout this text. So the first portion is the introductory part. And then Swamiji, one by one, takes up some of these common bases of Hinduism. He begins with the Vedas, then creation, the idea of the Atman, then ignorance, which is the cause of bondage. Then he speaks about spiritual practice, which is the way of getting out of this bondage, the way to freedom. The next 2 things Swamiji discusses is non-duality and image worship. And I think that's important because almost at the one end of the spectrum, we might say, the philosophical subtlety of Hindu thought took them to this non-duality. And on the other hand, you find within the tradition, image worship. How can these two coexist at the same time and still be someone who is worshipping images is that person less or more of a Hindu than someone who is just sees that truth in the non-dual terms? And then next Swamiji speaks about the harmony of religion, the ideal of harmony that is one of the important points within Hinduism. And then finally concludes with what is the meaning of the ideal of a universal religion? So these are some of the points that are addressed here. They are very compact, but we will have time to, we'll go slowly and then be able to reflect on every one of these points. Let's begin with the introduction. So this was read at the Parliament of Religions on 19th of September, 1893. Three religions now stand in the world which have come down to us from time prehistoric: Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, and Judaism. They have all received tremendous shocks, and all of them prove by their survival their internal strength. But while Judaism failed to absorb Christianity and was driven out of its place of birth by its all-conquering daughter, and a handful of Parsis is all that remains to tell the tale of their grand religion, sect after sect arose in India and seemed to shake the religion of the Vedas to its very foundations. But like the waters of the seashore in a tremendous earthquake, it receded only for a while, only to return in an all-absorbing flood, 1,000 times more vigorous. And when the tumult of the rush was over, these sects were all sucked in, absorbed, and assimilated into the immense body of the Mother Faith. So Swamiji begins clearly by mentioning about three oldest religious traditions surviving today: Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, and Judaism. And as I mentioned just earlier, none of these three names are indigenous to the tradition themselves. If you look in ancient Hebrew texts, they don't refer to themselves as Judaism, their tradition as Judaism. Not the word Hindu itself does not appear in any Hindu scriptures. And the Parsis, the religion, they didn't call themselves Zoroastrianism. So again, the naming, the defining, the stereotyping, this always occurs in life. It's the powerful that get to define, name, and stereotype the less powerful. So this is one point to be noted, that all of these names are later inventions, later foisted upon those traditions, mostly from Western sources. It's also interesting that all of these three ancient traditions all were born in Asia. So while today Judaism, and especially Christianity, which came out of Judaism, is seen as a Western religion, it's good to remember that that they all originated in Asia. And then he mentions how that the very fact that these three traditions survive today show that there is some strength there, in spite of, he says, proved by their survival, in spite of all received tremendous shocks. Now, these shocks often would mean the upheavals that occur in the regions in which these traditions thrived. Judaism was in the Middle East, Zoroastrianism in present-day Iran, in Persia, and Hinduism, of course, was in the Indian subcontinent. And so they were so old, and so many social, cultural upheavals took place there, even political upheavals. The very fact that these were able to survive all those shocks show that there is some inbuilt strength in there. It's a little bit like when there is an earthquake or a hurricane, we find many houses are just razed to the ground, and perhaps a few, some solitary few, even though they are in the path of the hurricane, may survive. And then all that we can say is maybe they had a very strong foundation, or the way it was built was able to withstand all those forces. Same is true with these traditions as well. But while Judaism failed to absorb Christianity and was driven out of its place by birth by all-conquering daughter, and of course, through history we know that although Jesus could be seen as a Jewish reformer within the tradition, but how, because of his charismatic figure and the influence, the tremendous influence that he exerted, gradually, for one reason or other, his followers acquired a distinct identity. Rather than seeing themselves as reformed Jews, they just said, we are different. And so none of the Christianity wasn't like born in a day. There wasn't like one day, this day Christianity started. It's a very slow process. So the early followers of Jesus, they saw them, they were Jewish people. But how over time a group separates itself from the other group and says, we are different, and this is our identity, this is who we are. So it's a process that takes time. And in Christianity's case, we know, of course, that it spread on a much larger area, became much more powerful in many ways. And that's what he means by saying that it was Christianity, which grew out of Judaism, became more powerful than the mother faith. And Parsis, of course, the number of Parsis is in some sense, it's an alarming thing. For people within the tradition are also alarmed by the fast dwindling numbers. And the numbers are dwindled for many reasons, one among which was that in their quest to maintain the purity of the tradition, they did not have neither a scope for proselytization, and if any among the Zoroastrians, if they married outside their faith, then they were outside, and their children were not this thing. So it was just an one-way traffic, everyone leaving, no one coming in. But things are now have been reformed a little bit in recent decades. So I don't know the details, but now there is some way in which even if one of the parents is a Zoroastrian, there is some way by which the children can adopt that faith. So, and I think that's the only way it might be possible to numerically maintain the tradition. And then he says how in India, how many different traditions rose, many different reformers came, and he says, sect after sect arose in India and seemed to shake the religion of the Vedas to its very foundations. And among the well-known among these, we can mention at least two. One is the Buddha, and the other is the Tirthankar Mahavir. And two traditions now that we are aware of are Buddhism and Jainism. Now, just as Jesus was not Christian, Buddha was not a Buddhist. So Buddha was a Hindu reformer who wanted to reform, and there is no indication anywhere in Buddha's teachings that he's starting a new religion or a new faith. But even in India, because of the same, it's a kind of how history repeats itself. Of course, this happened even before Jesus is coming. So the Buddha, his followers, over time, again, it took a generation or two or three, when his followers began to see themselves as separate. It first began with a sect within Hinduism, and then a separate identity itself. Same was true with the followers of Tirthankar Mahavir, who are known as Jains today. And what he mentions here is the tremendous earthquake receded for a while. A tsunami is really an earthquake inside an ocean or a sea. And oftentimes, if you have seen some of the video clips of some of the recent tsunamis, when there is a tsunami, for a while, the water just seems to go in. It seems like a big low tide. And then suddenly just comes and big wave and tremendous destruction. It just kind of absorbs everything. So Swamiji says something like that happened in the Hindu tradition. While all these great reformers came, they did not just take what the Hindu mentality, and this was not like planned or anything, because Hinduism has always been a decentralized tradition. There's never one pope or one organization. And so the things that happened were not decided upon by any one person or any one organization. It just seems to be inbuilt in the tradition itself. And what it did was that while these great reformers came, and the way they were absorbed is, rather than telling the Buddha or the Buddhists saying, no, you guys don't belong to us, you are different. What the tradition did was, Buddha became one of the avatars. Buddha, so they've already have the idea of the concept of the periodic descent of the divine. And so while the Hindus worship many deities, Buddha became one of the deities. Mahavir Tirthankar became one of the deities. So this was a way of reabsorbing the elements that could have been separated if they were allowed to remain alienated. And that's why within India today, there are Buddhists, there are Jains, but they're almost indistinguishable. In fact, in the southern India, there are a few of the very ancient Orthodox temples, and so they have a board. They say non-Hindus not allowed inside. The reason why this was done, this was not kind of a part of the tradition itself, but especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, a lot of the tourists and journalists who went to the eastern parts of the world, and it had gotten exoticized so much, the Oriental and the Arabian Nights and all kinds of things. So a lot of these people went and they would make documentaries and then bring it and show it to the people in the West. So, and because the emphasis was on the exotic, the weird, or the strange, and so when there would be a worship of Ganesha, for instance, and people would go take photographs and videos, and maybe on some, you see some old documentaries in BBC or something, said, oh, these people worship elephant-headed deities. And so what the people saw was that what was sacred to them was getting caricatured by people who came inside the place of worship with a very different attitude, to kind of as a curiosity rather than with faith and devotion, and to kind of put an end to that, because it hurt the sensitivities of the believers within the tradition. And so that was the reason some of these temples said, we will not allow people who don't believe in these things inside, because we want to preserve the sanctity of the place. Now, I mention this because in all of those places, Buddhists and Jains are never stopped. In India, they are never seen as non-Hindus per se. I mean, they have a freedom to say, we are Buddhists, we are not Hindus, but Hindus themselves don't see them as non-Hindus. And that's why while Buddhism today has flourished all over the world, it was perhaps the first missionary religion in the world. the only difference is, of course, they spread without taking recourse to the sword and fight and wars. But they were the first to move out of their place of origin and spread to different countries and take this great teaching of the Buddha all over the world. But within India itself today, they're almost a non-entity. Same thing with regard to Jains. There are, as I said, that is not to say that Buddhists and Jains don't exist. They are there, but they are seen as a within this great body of the Hindu tradition, in a way in which probably Christianity and Islam haven't been absorbed within India today in a way that Buddhism and Jainism have been. So that is what he meant by saying they were all sucked in, absorbed, and assimilated into the immense body of the Mother Faith. So we have all these great traditions. There are the Vaishnavas who worship Vishnu. There are the Shaivas who worship Shiva. There are the worshippers of the goddesses of Durga, Kali. We'll be soon having worship of those goddesses here. And it's not that they all always agreed with each other. In fact, there are lots of funny stories and even some terrible stories about how they disagreed and how they argued. So it wasn't that they all agreed, but every one of them identified as, I'm a Hindu. I may be worshipping a deity which looks very different, has a different theology, I may observe different festivals, but I am a Hindu. And so that's what Swamiji is trying to do here, that in spite of all these differences, what is it that makes all of these people, all who have been kind of absorbed into this vast ocean, what are the things that, what is the common factor joining them all? And he mentioned that in the next para, the immensity of the tradition. From the high spiritual flights of the Vedanta philosophy, of which the latest discoveries of science seem like echoes, to the low ideas of idolatry with its multifarious mythology, the agnosticism of the Buddhists and the atheism of the Jains, each and all have a place in the Hindu's religion. And that's a question that is often asked. Well, what makes a person Hindu? And that's not such an easy question to answer. For most people might say, well, if I'm just born in a Hindu family, I'm a Hindu. Some people might say that, well, if the Hindu ideals make sense to me or resonate with my head and heart, and I try to live like a Hindu, then I'm a Hindu. So there is no uniformity whatsoever, even in the simple question as, who is a Hindu? What does it mean to be a Hindu? Or what do I have to do? I have to do anything to be a Hindu? And because it encompasses, on one side is this highest philosophy, including image worship, there is mythology, there are agnostics, there are atheists, and all of them have a place in the Hindu's religion. And then the final para. Where then the question arises, where is the common center to which all these widely diverging radii converge? Where is the common basis upon which all these seemingly hopeless contradictions rest? And this is the question I shall attempt to answer. So this is what Swamiji is going to do in this essay. That this mind-boggling diversity we find in this very ancient tradition, is there any unifying factor in it? And what are those unifying factors? And this is the thing that we will discuss going forward. So what are your thoughts about what we have said so far? Any ideas, any questions? Yeah.
Just a question on the subject that Swamiji took. Given he was accepted to the parliament so late, it's unlikely that he would have been given the mantle to speak of all Hinduism. Did he assume that role himself, to speak not
I think Swamiji saw himself as a Hindu. Swamiji did not see himself as, oh, I'm a non-dualistic Vedanta, or no, Swamiji didn't see himself as that way. And that's why it became then his responsibility. So what does it mean to be a Hindu? Now you are representing Hinduism, and Hinduism is this such vast, diverse ocean. And what are the unifying factors? That's why he took it upon himself to try to almost kind of recreate the Hindu identity for the times in which we live. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Yeah, Bill? Yeah, just a minute. Yeah, just a minute, you can get that. Yeah.
The idea of, let's see, Hindus having different images they worship or speak to and so on implies a dualism of some sense there, I'm assuming. And Vedanta is a non-dualistic, but isn't one of these, the idea of unity almost implies two things coming together. So the idea of unity, does that almost imply dualism? And is unity and dualism actually both part of the same thing? Either in Vedanta tradition or Hindu, or do they vary between the two?
Two things. First of all, image worship doesn't necessarily imply dualism.
Okay.
And unity also doesn't necessarily mean many things coming together. It could also mean that things are one, that they seem to be many. Mm-hmm. And so when when my perception becomes clear, mm-hmm. I will see that there were never really many in the first place. Okay. So while the perception of the many is not denied, the reality of the many is questioned.
Okay.
That's the idea. Any other thought? Yeah.
So Swamiji, like I've read or heard before that, the definition of a Hindu would be somebody that affirms the truth of the Vedas as they are in India. Is that too restrictive of a definition of a Hindu?
Yes. In fact, that will be the first point Swamiji will next take up.
I see.
That about Vedas. Again, it's important to know that Vedas are the central text of the Hindu tradition. It's not necessary that everyone should have read the Vedas. But it's necessary to acknowledge that they are the main scripture. And one of the reasons Buddhism could not survive in India, or Jainism could not survive in India, partly because they did not make this explicit declaration that Vedas are the supreme authority. And so their philosophy in orthodox circles are not considered an orthodox philosophy. So that's why, as themselves, they had practically no existence within India. And that's why they just got absorbed into the whole thing, became, as I said, the Buddha and the Mahavir were seen as worshipful reformers of the Hindu tradition. Yeah. Yeah.
So, Swamiji, you mentioned that Christianity and Muslim religions were not absorbed in India. However, Jainism and obviously Buddhism were. But what about Sikhism? Because, that's also kind of, all of them were born out of India. And so...
Sikhism is even more recent. Sikhism as a distinct identity. In fact, honestly, I came to know it's a separate religion only after I came here 20 years ago. In India, we never thought of Sikhs as a different religion per se. Again, these temples that I mentioned where non-Hindus are not allowed. And the Sikhs are very visible. I mean, it's very easy to identify a Sikh because of the turban and the beard. And even in the South India, when Sikhs go, they are never stopped at these temples which say non-Hindus not allowed. And a lot of this has to do with, it's more a political issue. In the 80s, there was this big secessionist movement in Punjab about Khalistan and all of that. And that really created a big wedge and made at least a good section of the Sikh community as a feeling that we are different. And so there are a lot of social and political factors involved. In fact, what I have heard is that in some of these great Sikh gurus were such great inspiration and amazing love for God and their sacrifice that the firstborn son in many Punjabi Hindu families was given for the protection of the tradition. And so it made a disciple, a shishya. It's the shishya that became Sikh. Sikh is really, so it was all, and so they were seen for, and they still are seen as the defenders of the faith. A lot of the aggressions that occurred in India in earlier centuries all came from the northwestern frontier. And first, Punjab was right there. And so they had to bear the brunt of all these aggressions that occurred. And so very quickly, those within the tradition realized that we needed some defenders, some armed people to protect their temples, to protect their women, to protect their traditions. And so the firstborn son was really given to the tradition. And so it has had just like all these other traditions, it began within the Hindu movement. In fact, a lot of the parts of Guru Granth Sahib, the scripture of the Sikh tradition, has songs addressed to Hari and Krishna and all many of those whom we would say, well, these are all Hindu deities. And so the division of them as like some religion which is unconnected with Hinduism just doesn't hold ground. But again, this is not a theological issue. This lot of these religious identities are born from many factors, oftentimes non-religious factors. A lot of political, social factors come in, and that's it. So there is no harm in Sikhism being considered a separate religion, but it's good to know how religious identities gather and are acquired.
The other question.
In fact, once I was traveling in India, I remember in the probably in the early 80s, I think. I was going from train from Chennai to Calcutta. It's a fairly long train ride. And sitting in the train opposite to me was one army officer. And that was the time the big trouble was going on in the northwestern part, Punjab. And so we were speaking. And then he said, he was a retired officer, and he said until 1980 or so, whenever anyone went to join Indian Army, they had to fill up the application form, and against the column which says religion, they all put it as a Sikh Hindu. So they didn't put it there as some different religion. In fact, and this needs verification because I've heard it secondhand, many of the Indian Muslims, when they go for Hajj, they are often called as Hindu Muslims because they are not Arabs, and so they are not really seen as like the original Muslims. So again, I mean, that's just human nature to kind of, ideally we might say, oh, we are all one. But the human tendency is to then make this segregation. No, we are different, you are different. And that creating that difference could be on the basis of many different factors. It's just human nature. Yeah.
The other point, sorry, just
Yeah.
you made, Swamiji said about Jainism is the word atheism came in there. I wonder what that meant, because I have a lot of friends Jain and I've gone to Jain temples,
Right, right.
Palitana and all that.
Yeah, yeah.
You don't see that sort of, there is not image, but there are images there as well.
No, image itself I don't think is an issue here. Whether you see that image with what is generally considered a Godhead. And I don't think the way the idea of God is understood in most traditions, that kind of a God exists in Jainism. Yes, they have an idea of freedom, of getting free from samsara. But God, that idea doesn't exist, at least in the way it's understood in other traditions. Yeah. Yeah, Srikant.
Swamiji, I had a question about Hindu, the name itself. Like at that time, was it popular to know all the most people in India, they are called Hindus, or who called
Yes.
Hindus?
Well, at least from the records that are available to us, at least from the government perspective, sometime I believe in 1830s or so, the first time that you have a recorded instance of people's religion being called Hinduism. So it's possible that it just didn't start on one day. I'm sure a few years before that, people must have been informally. The British were ruling, and it was they say, well, because the only word that comes in Hindu religion, Hindu texts, is Esha Dharma Sanatanaha. So people speak about Sanatana Dharma. And well, you're not free to say who you are. So the British said, okay, you are Hindus, and that's who we are. That's how it is. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, Aruna?
Swamiji, I thought before it was called Aryavart. And Aryavart, the
Aryavart is the place of the Aryas,
and
not
right,
the religion
and-
itself. No.
But I thought we were called the Aryas before.
Yeah. Hena.
I'm just making the statement which Mahendra asked about Sikhism. Sikhism founded in 1469 by, so it's very new compared to Hinduism. It's 16th century.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Again, yeah, and also when the again, I mean, technically you cannot say Sikhism was founded. The idea is in that time, did people who were followers of the Sikh gurus saw themselves as, oh, we are different religion, we are not these Hindus. Yeah. That's the idea.
Yeah.
So Sikhism as a distinct entity, as separate from Hinduism, is a more recent phenomenon.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, in the Kumbh Mela, which is said to be it's in the Guinness Book of World Record, the largest religious gathering in the world. So there are all these big groupings among the monastic communities, and they are often called akhadas. And so one big akhada is called the Udasi akhada. It was started by Guru Nanak's eldest son, and they are part of the very orthodox Hindu monastic community, the Udasi akhada. So it's all intermingled. It's not as cut and dry, separate as we think. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that there were two methods of interpreting Eastern texts. One was the Western, one was the Eastern perspective. I was wondering if you had an example of that. I'm just curious.
Example of what?
Example of how Western thought would interpret the same thing versus Eastern. I'm just wondering.
No, I don't think I can give some specific example, but know it for certain that if you are studying now the Gita, the Upanishad from an English translation, and especially if that English translation is done by someone, a scholar from outside the tradition, will be a very Western way to look at it. I mean, one simple example I can give you, and it is this. So we were studying that text called Panchadashi in the 80s under this teacher about whom I mentioned. His name was Kalyana Sundar Shastrigal. He was born in 1911. He actually passed away just a month after I came to Boston. So he was once teaching us this book called Panchadashi. And so on the first day itself, I asked a question which to me seemed a very natural question. It was like, well, what is the date of this book? In which century was it written? And who is really the authorship that is ascribed? Who is this author? And he was like, what does it matter? Now, that's what I'm saying. So a kind of a Western approach would be, well, here is this ancient text. How ancient is it? When was it written? Who is this person? And so on. So, and I'm not saying these questions are invalid, but that's one way of looking at it. And the orthodox way of looking at it is, as what my teacher said was, what does it matter? He said that because the Upanishads or the Vedas are seen as having no human authorship, that the Vedas are the revealed text of the Hindus, if what this book that we are studying now is in harmony with what the Upanishads say, and it is helping you understand the Upanishad better, it's good. It doesn't matter whether it was written 700 years ago or maybe 7 days ago. So something that is old is not necessarily good or true just because it is old. And something that is more recent is not necessarily questionable just by the very fact that it is more recent. Because sometimes I think in the field of religion and spirituality, we kind of give so much importance, oh, this is so ancient. And we make a virtue out of ancient things, thinking that if it's ancient, it must be good. And what the attitude is now, it doesn't matter whether it's ancient or now. What matters is, does it really solve your problem and the problem of existence itself? So again, these are like two approaches to look at it. Well, one example. Yeah. Anything else? Okay, here's the last question for today.
Vivekananda has said that in one of the little pamphlets that Vedanta would become a religion, or it would be hard for it to become a religion. What's the distinction between Vedanta as it exists and Hinduism as a religion?
Again, the word religion itself can be used in many different ways, and so I think it's a big subject. We can talk about it in future because Vedanta itself, some people see it as just one kind of a philosophical part of Hinduism. Some people see Vedanta itself, as Swami Vivekananda said, is a kind of a more accurate term for the entire tradition, because Hinduism is not an indigenous term. So the word Vedanta itself gets interpreted in many ways, just as the word religion gets interpreted in many ways. So I think, in fact, the next topic we are going to study next week is about the Vedas, and I think we'll have more chance to discuss Vedanta then. So we'll stop here today. And as I said, there are all these at least 8 to 9 topics that Swamiji will discuss in the course of this paper. So next week, we'll look at what Swamiji said about both Vedas and about creation. These are the 2 points we will discuss next Wednesday. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhurmuhu. this Saturday we will not have evening meditation because we have to prepare for the puja on Sunday. So Sunday we'll have the big puja of the year, Durga Puja. It will begin at 10:30. We'll have, as always, prayer, meditation, flower offering, big worship, music, and then prasad. So all of you are welcome. Please come on Sunday at 10:30. Next Wednesday we'll continue this study, and next Tuesday our meditation will also continue as usual. So let's conclude with a prayer now. May the Divine Being, who is the Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Great Spirit of the Native Americans, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May we be granted strength, freedom, and clear understanding. May we learn to see God in our own hearts and in everyone around us. May God bless us all and fill our hearts with gratitude, grace, and love. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.